Welcome to Zelda's Peaches and Biscuits podcast. I'm Alaina Doughton, the executive director of the Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum, and I'm joined with
Maura Martello. I am a Zelda researcher, a Zelda fan, and I am a docent here at the museum. Welcome. I think this is episode 9.
Yes. So today we thought we'd go over some of Zelda's favorite books or books that were very influential in her life. And just a brief summary of that. The first one is Zelda's Fortune, for which she was named. The other is Surry of Eagle's Nest, which we have her copy here at the museum. And in the flyleaf, she's written that it's the best book ever. Did you like it? So we thought if she had this strong a reaction or loved a book so greatly, we should probably try to read it.
Yeah.
Okay, so
we've spent a couple of days going over these novels.
Yes. So first, Zelda's Fortune. It is a very dense book. Hopefully you will have seen either on our Facebook or in our social media the links if you... we put it out there to see if you could get through it. I didn't get all the way through it, did you? I tried. I really tried. After reading it, I noticed in quite a number of different either biographies or scholarship that people will make reference to the fact that she was named for the book. And it's about either, I think the term they use is gypsy, we would say Roma now. And she's kind of a palm reader, the
fortune teller.
The fortune teller.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered, well, why don't they synopsize it? And I thought, well, I found it on Google Books. I couldn't find a copy online, like a physical copy. And then I realized trying to read it, they probably didn't read it. If they found a copy of it, they probably didn't get through it.
Yeah. I don't know exactly when that was published. The book that I've been trying to read, the Eagle's Nest book, was published in 1866.
Well, Zelda's Fortune was published in 1874.
Okay.
I was trying to go through all the newspapers to see how it was received. It had a really great reception in the UK, particularly London and like Birmingham papers, and it was published in 1874, so it's quite a Victorian book. Like the first chapter, it's about, this woman, and the first chapter is this very dense...
Descriptive?
Yes, of on the ship with Dutch sailors, and it's kind of written semi-vernacular, and you're like... I don't know what I'm reading. So then I tried to fast forward or flip through about, Zelda. And it just seems like this incredibly dense. It's written by a man.
Who is the author?
The author is, I don't see it. I'm sorry.
It's funny, all these years I've just assumed that it was written by a woman.
It's written by a gentleman, and it's very obvious. It feels very, to use a modern term, very mansplaining. And just very dense and just kind of needlessly descriptive.
It must have meant something to Zelda's mother, though.
It must have. I mean, the character is very interesting. She's very. When you look, I hate to say this, when I was looking at the illustrations or the pictures, it seems very melodramatic. She's doing these various of hand fortune. You go ahead. What's the author?
The author's name is Robert Edward Francillon.
Yes. That's it. Because the copy I made, it just has it has the title page, but it says by the author of Earl's Dean, Pearl and Emerald. From what I gathered in the reviews is that he writes these kinds of, these, I don't want to call them romance novels because it's not.
Adventure novels, would you?
No, they're about... They're like a man doing Austen, maybe. It just seemed there was no actual like today's romance novel is going to have a lot of physical description, or is going to be on the edge of eroticism. There's nothing like that in
no matter how hard you look.
And it's just like it just seemed like Victorian melodrama, but it was just very dense.
Yeah.
And each page, If you got and we again, the link is, if you haven't seen it already, the link will be on our show notes, and you can go find it. It's on Google Books.
I'm looking at the book right now, and I have to tell you, it is dense is the perfect word for it. I mean, it's
240 pages, and each page is a double column, and it's just. And so I kept trying. There are these subchapter headings, and you just kind of trying to follow along, and I don't know, maybe it's virtue of the you're in the shutdown, but I kept trying, and I'm not entirely sure of the narrative.
Yeah.
So to the previous Zelda biographers who kind of just say, yes, she was named for this book, I feel you, because they either couldn't find it or they didn't get through it either.
Yeah.
So I don't know that Zelda's Fortune as a book, she was named for this book. We don't know how much her mother loved the book, or if she just liked the name.
That's entirely possible. I never thought about that. You always think that this glorious heroine inspired the name, but perhaps it was just the unusual name.
And I also I did look up, well, how unusual a name was Zelda at that time? It wasn't that unusual of a name. There were some other famous Zeldas at the time. An actress, and the reason I know is when you're doing the searches through the newspapers and whatnot, a lot of Zeldas come up. So if you just think, oh, I'll put Zelda. No, there's quite a few. So I don't know. This book was very popular. It was reviewed very well. From what I saw, only in the UK. I really didn't see it here. So, there weren't any major reviews in American newspapers. So I don't know what indication that shows us, is that her mother we know that her mother's reading tastes were probably a little bit wider than her contemporaries. Yes. So
I'm sure it was a library book. I'm sure at a certain point she probably had to stay inside, because in those days, I mean, she was reading this when she was pregnant with Zelda, I believe.
Yeah, maybe.
So she probably was kind of holed up inside, going through novels.
Well, also, we don't. When her mother's pregnant, there's no TV, there's no radio. Yeah. I mean, these were the entertainment. So a dense novel was probably, and you think it's not that. If you think of Dickens and how dense Dickens is, this is like a minor Dickens. Yeah. And if you find Dickens hard to read, you might.
People have much longer attention spans than we do.
Well,
that's just the way it is, unfortunately.
It's just
for us, not for them.
Well, I think also when you think about, which we'll get to in a minute, the taste. We know that from interviews from Scotty, that Scott quite loved Dickens and read Dickens almost ad nauseum to Scotty as a child. She said he almost burned her. It wasn't her word term, burned her up, but he would read Dombey and Sons every night. And so you just think the quality of language, even, going back to Shakespeare, how the detail of descriptions for the Shakespearean stage, because they didn't really have sets. So in the modern era, like, you have the set. You don't have to explain what the audience should be imagining or seeing. And I think that's where a lot of students, where the Lost Generation writers, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and even you can even think Zelda's novel is in that transitionary stage, how clean the language is now, how you're not describing as much, you're leaving more to the reader to do. And I think,
and you're not writing in dialect.
You're not writing
the way it often is in the 19th century, and which makes very tough going for readers.
Yeah. And so I think this novel, I mean, we don't know. We don't have a lot of indication if her mother loved the novel, or if she loved the name, or if she loved because the main character is kind of intrepid character, and I'll post some of the images from it. She's also, in the illustration, she's also very dark, which you think that, I think Rosalind was, some of the Sayre children were. I don't know if the fact that Zelda was quite blonde and quite fair in
I think
contrast.
Clotilde also is very dark-haired.
Yeah, so
Pale complexion.
yeah,
And of course, as we know, Zelda turned out to be quite the opposite of
yeah.
several of her sisters.
So in a way, the physical description in Zelda's fortune matches really Clotilde and Rosalind. We're not. I think Marjorie may have been more fair.
Yes, certainly Noonie was her daughter.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I think Anthony and Judge Sayre were quite dark hair. So it seems that the physical description, she may have been anticipating it. I don't know if she was anticipating the character. That it's kind of, she's this very forward character. So anyway, if you get through Zelda's Fortune and want to send us your opinion or your synopsis, we'd be glad to hear it. But whoo,
it was tough though.
And I don't think either of us are.
No, I think
we're strong readers.
Yeah. I even have a college degree in it.
So,
but it didn't do me much good with Zelda's Fortune. Nor, I have to be honest, with the second book we're discussing today, Surry of Eagle's Neck.
Surry Nest. It's Surry of Eagle's Nest. And the reason that we chose it is that we do have Zelda's copy here at the Fitzgerald Museum. And in the flyleaf is what we have on display. Written inside, it was given to Zelda by her mother for Christmas in 1913. It says Zelda Sayre, Christmas 1913. She uses an X for Christmas. I just
throwing that out there.
Yeah. Don't think it meant what we argue about today. It says from Mama, and then she goes, "This is the best book I have ever read. Take care of it." And then she re-signs it May 27, 1916. Zelda Sayre. Of course, these we'll have these on our show pages and on the Instagram. Then she writes, "Please take care of this book." And then you can, because it has a very young, and she goes, "This is a splendid book. This book is wonderful." And you can see some of this is written in ink, some of it is written in pencil. So she's clearly revisited this book. So from when she's 13 till she's 16. And then in the back of the book, and I had books, I think I did this when you're, a teenage girl, because did you like it?
Oh, are they passing it back and forth at the school?
I don't know, but she writes in the back, "Did you like it? Please take care of it. I thought it's the best book I ever read, January 9, 1913. And then she signs her name, Zelda, again. So one, I want to discuss how we have this copy of the book. But two, that she loved it, and that she, by writing in the flyleaf, assumes there's going to be an audience. She says, "Did you like it?" So we're kind of put it out to our listeners.
Last week we were speaking about how she put on plays. Is it possible she adapted this for one of her little plays?
Maybe, because, well, let's talk about how we have the book, and because I've never read anything from the biographies about these early books, probably because, again, biographers don't know that they exist. A lot of the books that we have been given to us over the years. Most recently, about a year and a half ago, someone just dropped off a bag of books. I thought they were for our little local corner library that's on the edge of the property, but they weren't. They were Scotty and Zelda's books. And so most people don't realize Scotty moved back to Montgomery in the early
70s, I believe.
Yeah, late 60s, early 70s. She lived here in the neighborhood a few blocks away. And she died in 86. And while living here, she compiled The Romantic Egoist, which was a compilation of their various scrapbooks. Scotty's scrapbooks are still here in Montgomery. I think items from Scott and Zelda's I know that Scott and Zelda's scrapbooks are now at Princeton, but identical materials still here in Montgomery. I don't know if it was produced when she was doing The Romantic Egoist, but a lot of that material is here in Montgomery. And then Scotty had cancer. She knew she was dying, and she would invite friends over and would just start, "Here, choose what you like."
Yes. She would have parties, and they were book giving away parties. She had all her parents' books, her own books, and you would choose. You would get to peruse the library and choose whatever it was you wanted. That's how we found out about the Zelda's cookbook, The Joy of Cooking, which was, kind of a thrill to find out that
she used it.
Yeah.
So we have a number of Zelda's books. I don't think she gave away so much Scott's books. I don't know that Zelda was as highly regarded at that time in the 80s. I don't know the relationship between Scotty and Zelda. Zelda clearly, I think, my opinion, she most likely had kind of early onset dementia. We haven't gotten into her mental health, but what probably have caused that. Family probably thought that she had mental illness of a different sort. And so I think Scotty may have more casually given her things away. But thankfully, a lot of them are still here in Montgomery, still here in the neighborhood, and people very graciously give it back. So we have I would say, and not only that, is we have quite a number of the Sayre family books. We have quite a number of Minnie's books, Judge Sayre's books.
I think you're right about this casual attitude towards Zelda. I know when I first moved here, which is almost 2 years ago now, I went to the reading room at the downtown library, and I was pleased to see that they had Sidney Lanier High School graduation books. But I was shocked out of my mind to see that I could just take out Zelda's 1918 edition. To me, it seemed that should have been preserved somehow.
Well, we have at least 2 copies.
Yeah.
And one copy I think we have is from the high school. Like high schools get rid of stuff. They gave it to us. And
it just seemed to me that it should have been better preserved.
Also, it turns up there's a thrift shop, and it sounds funny. I found my grandmother's 1940 Sidney Lanier High School yearbook. I found one of my aunt's high school yearbooks. I found my high school yearbook, and I found the year after Zelda's.
But do you think if it was F. Scott Fitzgerald's high school graduation yearbook, would it have been preserved better? I'm not saying necessarily.
I don't know. I think that's the interesting thing about historic figures, particularly, I think since 1996, no, because they had the big centenary in St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Paul for him. The theater is named for him. I think they tried to begin a museum, a Fitzgerald museum up there, which has since closed and has been folded back into, I think, a local library. I think, like small museums like us, it kind of rises and falls. I think the strength of the museum here is that people come for 2 different people, and then people come for Zelda for different reasons. Some are interested in her in a dancer. Some are interested in a writer. Some come because they find out we have the paintings. And I just think there's kind of an ebb and flow. So, and I think also, but in Montgomery, I think in one hand, people are very reticent to talk about her because of the perceived mental illness.
I've noticed that. I have to be honest with you. I have noticed that.
They're very protective of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or sometimes with people my age and younger, there's almost a joke as if she's not really worth discussing because she may have had mental illness, which I find very strange because many, many very gifted people have struggled with mental illness.
I think there's also the hometown syndrome. I think if you think about Hank Williams, people in Montgomery, there's a duality with Hank Williams because a lot of them, like my grandmother went to school with him. Her brother adored him. But if I tried to, several times I tried to get her to talk about him, and she finally goes, look, he wasn't nice. And so, and when you have these I think it's also the gap, if you've known anyone who's particularly famous, you know them as a person.
Yeah.
You don't know
As an icon,
as an icon, and you don't, you know them warts and all.
Yeah.
I grew up with some people who were quite famous, and saw them. They were, well, one was a child actor, and you see that transition, and it's kind of hard to talk about because you're like, well, I remember them when they were 15 or 16 or whatever. And I think that's kind of the hometown syndrome.
Yeah, it may very well be.
Yeah. So
But
going back to...
It's disappointing to me because as a Zelda fan who's, been living here, it's like, I want to talk about her, people.
Yeah. Well,
so at least I found
also
Alana here.
A lot of the people knew her in her final years, and in those very final years, I think, like you said, she clearly was exhibiting odd behavior, which I think was most likely, early dementia. That she walked a lot. She kind of had, you hear it in varying degrees, if she had this religious phase, if she was very preachy.
Yeah, she would go through religious phases. Also, if you look at some of the very last photos of her that are taken, I happen to think she looks very pretty in some of these photos. Her hair is longer and softer. But if you look at her clothing, it would break your heart if you're a Zelda fan. Obviously, she had no money for clothing.
I kind of disagree with that. I know that I don't think she cared. I think the one thing in her whole life is she wasn't a fashion plate. Well, I just think when she was younger, she was so vivacious. She wore sports clothes. Mm-hmm. I mean, her clothes were not particularly feminine ever in her life. And
the only thing I would say is that we have photographs of her in New York City and in Montgomery, and she's wearing these small, almost like moccasin shoes, which are so inappropriate to New York City. She's got a heavier coat on, so it's obviously we're either talking fall or winter. Yeah. So she doesn't have an adequate pair of shoes.
The other thing in terms of clothing history, she dies in 48, and from 42, 44 on, I mean, obviously it's the war, there's rationing, and women's clothes, the skirts get a little higher because you're using less fabric, it's rationed, and I'm just wondering if that's part of it. Because in the 30s, everything was bias cut, very long, it was, more glamorous. And in the 40s, everything gets more like a t-shirt. It's more square. Yeah, it's not cut to fit. There is.
You also have fake fabrics coming in. You have nylon and rayon and things like that, which are cheesy, to be honest.
Yeah, they don't drape well. And I wonder if some of that is it, because we also had, if you follow our Facebook and whatnot, Sam Lanahan sent us some unpublished letters, or copies of some unpublished letters, and in it Zelda asked for she asked her mother to have Marjorie look up a Vogue pattern. We found that pattern. It was from 1947. So she asked for it to be made. It was a junior's size 14. A friend of mine is a costumer, was able to eventually find it and made it for us. And so it's on display now. And it's kind of the pre-Dior wasp waist. It goes in. It is fitted. Okay. But, and she was able to find some basically acetate from the period. She was able, and so it's made.
Oh, I didn't know we knew the material.
Well, we know that Zelda's favorite colors are pink and red, and that she wore that quite a lot. And on the cover, the actual artwork for the pattern, one of the dresses in red, and we know that the letter isn't actually dated, but we know that the pattern's from 47. So we assume, and she is writing from Highland. She's writing her mother from North Carolina. So it's the dates are all correct. And so a friend of mine again is a costumer, and she was able to get some period acetate in red. It's kind of and when you see she's cut it, and she's done a beautiful job, but you see how it sits. The drape just isn't there from when you think the 30s. And in the 30s, they're still wearing silk and cotton. It's cut on the bias. If you don't know what that means, it means that the fabric is cut on an angle the grain. It's not straight up and down. So if it's a plaid, it would look like a diamond shape. Mm-hmm. But what that does is that allows the fabric to stretch. And that's how you get those really beautiful curves with very simple seams in the 30s. And in the 40s, you get this rayon or this acetate that's stiff, it's blocky, it doesn't drape well, it just kind of sticks out.
Well, I guess all the material is now going to make, you know, cord, cotton.
And then you actually see the patterns begin to shift because by cutting on the bias, you're using a lot more fabric because you're having to do those angle cuts. And so I think some of it's the economy. Mm-hmm. We also know from some letters that she went through these phases of, like Scott says, well, at least we're out of the circus phase, and that Scotty was kind of embarrassed maybe. And then it was in a letter to Scott sends maybe help her pick out a dress. Mm-hmm. So we don't know, but she's also painting at that time. We know she has these beautiful paintings of acrobats and ballet dancers and whatnot. So I don't know if that's affecting her style. We've strayed so far from the novels,
I know.
But it's fabulous, so I don't care. So I don't know. Yeah. So the clothes, I don't know that her clothes are. I just don't think the time period is that. It's kind of blah. I find the 40s. I mean, you have like the Andrews sisters, and they kind of, get the shoulder pads or Schiaparelli.
Well, I kind of, because, that's all we watched as, baby boomers. All we watched as children were 1940s films, So that's why somebody like Bette Midler started recording, as a baby boomer, started recording all the Andrews sisters movies, is because that's all that was on television. So maybe we have a more open attitude towards the fashions of that time. I don't know. Yeah. But we should get back.
Okay, so let's go back to Surry. So where we trailed off is that one, we have this book, and we most likely have it because someone chose it. You were saying that Surry of Eagle's Nest has a lot of good reviews on Amazon. Which that surprised me. For a couple reasons.
Okay. Yes. For some reason, people are writing the same thing that Zelda's writing. This is the best book I've ever read. I have a feeling you could, I certainly would get your opinion. I have a feeling these are either historians or Civil War buffs who are obviously purchasing this book and then writing about it.
The other thing, and we'll kind of venture into it in the time period and the climate we're in now, is that this is a Civil War account. It's the Battle of Virginia.
It's about. I have a few details on this book. It was written in 1866, and it was written by John Eston Cook. And the full name of the book is Surry of Eagle's Neck, or The Memoirs of a Staff Officer Serving in New Jersey.
No, Virginia.
Virginia. So, talk about self-correcting on my machine here. I can only blame my computer for that.
Well, I printed out.
I don't know where New Jersey came from.
That's okay.
Anyway, sorry.
I think that's the publisher. Because I printed out one from 1866. It's a newspaper, two different newspaper ads. So you want me to read just the quick... The advertisement.
Sure, if you want.
So it says, this thrilling historic story, which has been out of print and for which has been such a great demand, is now issued as a subscription book with many magnificent illustrations. There has never been a more popular book throughout the southern states than Surry of Eagle's Nest. Many years have passed since the thrilling scenes herein recounted of the deeds of valor of the Confederate soldier, yet the interest by those who fought with Ashby, Stewart, Johnson, Beauregard, Jackson, and Lee. This thrilling story pictures not alone joy and sorrow and a love sweetly told, but is filled with historic incidents of the great contest between the South and the North. The thing that I find as a historian, because I teach world history or have for a number of years, is that in the moment that we live into with the pulling down all these Confederate statues, that the one thing that I find students don't quite realize is how many soldiers on both sides, North and South, were conscripted, which we would call drafted now. So that you have all of these soldiers fighting. It wasn't like you joined up. It wasn't like, do you know what I mean? I would liken in some ways it to the Vietnam War, where you have, you're drafted and you're fighting a war you may not be for, you may not entirely understand. And then after the fact, particularly if you were like the Johnny Reb figure versus the Billy Yank, we don't even hardly talk about the Billy Yank figure, but everyone kind of knows that Johnny Reb. It's kind of been strangely glorified, in part because a lot of these men were forced to fight in a war they didn't want to fight. And if you think African Americans fought on both sides because they were drafted or conscripted. And so I think it's not, the only reticence I have is that when you say the word Confederate at this moment, it becomes immediately synonymous with someone who was glorifying slavery, was romanticized it, and was ardently going to give their life to save this institution. And I don't think that's what this novel is about.
Right. It is a novel, and it is about Stonewall Jackson, actually, Thomas Jackson, who was a great. It was part of the Northern Army of Virginia, along with Robert E. Lee. He was killed at Chancellorsville, I think. The author actually was an aide-de-camp to Jeb Stuart. If you know anything about Civil War history, General Jeb Stuart is considered sort of the cavalier figure in Civil War history. You know, he wore a plumed hat. He was very good looking. Even the photographs today show a handsome man. Unfortunately, General Stuart was not a huge fan of the author. He sort of had to take the author on because his wife Flora was related to Mr. Cook, and he thought he was. In fact, he told his wife that he was a big bore. So
sounds like they're mansplaining this one too.
But obviously, this book appealed amazingly to the tomboy Zelda.
Yeah. I think what differentiates this is that it is, and we know that Zelda and the other lists that we have really liked Kipling. Mm-hmm. And if you think Kipling was a civil servant, he was not at the top. You know, this isn't about Lee or Jefferson Davis. It's not, or Grant. You know, it's that this is the narrative of someone farther down the chain. Mm-hmm. And if you think these war narratives, war is still, the other thing, the Victorian era, and even through the First World War, we don't have it today, but there was a great romanticization about war, that giving your life on the battlefield was just this glorious death. Yeah. And I think
we start getting some pushback on that, let's say, in World War I, where
World War I destroys it. But,
right.
But as World War I begins, there's still that romanticization. Yes. But World War I is just so devastating.
It blows it out of the water.
Well, you have mechanized war. You go from, like, in the Civil War, you have the cavalry, you have the foot soldier. But in World War I, you have the machine gun. You have tanks. You have the introduction of the airplane and dropping bombs. I mean, they had shrapnel bombs. That's like bombs bursting in air. I mean, those were shrapnel bombs. But then you also have biologic warfare and trench warfare in World War I.
And you start getting anti-war novels written, not anti-war novels, anti-war memoirs written by soldiers like Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves. Goodbye to All That is the name of his book, which are very bitter books about the First World War. So everything is topsy-turvy now.
I think between the Civil War, because the Civil War, you also have the introduction of the camera, and you begin to see propaganda. Well, both ways is that you have pro-war photos. You know, you see pictures of Lincoln and Grant. You know, and then you begin to see the first images of war dead.
Yes,
and these horrific
and they're
images.
Brutal. They're absolutely
and just
brutal.
decomposing. And so I think So for a tomboy at this time, so she reads this in 1913, is that it's an action adventure novel. And I really think that you have to remove it from the kind of, it's not a is that,
Yeah, no, I understand.
it's not necessarily Confederate. It's not political.
Well, there was a time, if I can be honest about it, there was a time that a lot of these generals were not admired for their political points of view. They were admired because they were great leaders and warriors.
Yeah.
And that's what people liked about them.
I think Teddy Roosevelt's probably the last president that there was a physical component to. You know, he was a Rough Rider.
Yeah.
I know everyone's problematic, you know, but
That's right, he's gone too.
Yeah. Well, but you think like Washington was a general, and you just think how many of like the early presidents were they physical generals? I think the last military president we have is maybe Eisenhower. The rest
Yes.
have since have been
I suppose
politicians.
George Bush was in the National Guard, but he didn't see service.
Well, I think George the senior served.
Oh, yes, he was
yes.
a World War II veteran.
But what I mean, he was a veteran, but he wasn't
He wasn't a military leader.
That would have been Eisenhower, I think.
Yeah.
So I think when we talk about Surry of Eagle's Nest, is what she's responding to is that it is an adventure novel.
Yes.
And I think it's...
And a very dense one, I might add. It's not an easy read. Just like Zelda's Fortune is not. But it was written in 1866.
Yeah, so they're still very Victorian novels, and they're very... And I think when you read these and then you compare them against, say, Hemingway's, I think, he and Fitzgerald to me are the two sides of the coin, because Fitzgerald is more elegant, but they're so stripped down. And then Hemingway is more forceful.
Yeah.
I don't want to say brutish, but it's just more forceful, where Scott's more elegant. But when you compare, you really see how far the language has gone, is when you're like, however many pages into these, you're like, whew, okay, let's move it along.
And as a 20th century person for most of my life, you know, I'm used to the stripped down style of people like Hemingway. Even if I'm not reading Hemingway, everybody emulated him. So to go back in time and read, you know, a book from 1866, it's difficult, unless they're very great authors like a Dickens or a Thomas Hardy.
Yeah, I think that's reading these novels. These are probably they're obviously very popular for the time, and I think in terms of literature, you see why Dickens. You still read Dickens, you still read Hardy, because they're the best example of this time period. And I think what you're saying also is that Surry of Eagle's Nest is kind of a snapshot of the time, which would really appeal to historians. That there's a lot of detail. That's where, like, when we read Save Me the Waltz, when those early chapters in Montgomery, I know this sounds strange. They're just as a person from Montgomery, it's so great to see the detail about what life was like here, that I'm not even really reading it for literature, if that makes sense. Like, I'm not critiquing Zelda as a writer, particularly in those early chapters, is because she's describing a place. And I wonder if that's what the reviews for Surry of Eagle's Nest is for historians, because it becomes a gold mine.
Not exactly nostalgia is the wrong word,
but it's a wealth of knowledge of what we've lost.
And the detail that has been lost.
Yeah. It becomes a snapshot of the time period. So I think the analogy is, you're not looking at a photo that's great art. You're looking at it because you can see all the detail. It becomes a historic record.
Yeah.
So we wanted to go over a few other books. Now, the other book that we have, and I do think historians or the biographers do mention, is The Salamander, and I think we'll probably do a separate podcast on it. It was written by Owen Johnson, who is it's considered the first flapper novel, but he didn't use the term flapper in it. And it was a very popular book. We know that Zelda really loved it. It's most likely what some biographers say she patterned herself on. and so we will cover it. And then the others where we were going to kind of revisit some of the novels that she mentions having read in Save Me the Waltz.
Yes, there's apparently she would raid her. I have a feeling that she raided a lot of her family's separate libraries. We know that she delved into Boccaccio's Decameron. She mentions the naughty bits in that.
And that Rosalind had it hidden in
a drawer underneath some underwear or something.
I really wonder which copy. I tried to, because we don't have necessarily.
Oh, that would be fun to
because
acquire.
Some of them are illustrated.
Yeah.
And while there are nudes, they're very awkward. They're not that sexy. Like, or at least by not, and you're like, hey, there's, but I was looking online and the etchings are like, that's a little awkward.
Are these woodcuts or something?
Yeah, they're like etchings.
Are they medieval?
No, the ones that I found from around the early 1900s, they're etched. They kind of, because they would etch a plate and then print them.
Right.
But the figures are very stiff and awkward. They're kind of that weird Victorian.
Oh, it's very disappointing.
Yeah. Anyway, so you look, and I guess if you hadn't seen anything, and they're not particularly. There are nudes that almost seem like anatomic studies.
Clinical.
And they're very clinical. And then, there's something that's more seductive. Like the poses are just like the woman's just standing there.
Oh, we got to get some of these.
So maybe we'll
put up on the
yeah. So I just thought, well, if that's not very it was they were very stilted, very Victorian, but I guess, if you've never seen anything.
Certainly the stories themselves, I mean, some of them get quite graphic.
Yeah. Because we know, because we have the books, there's several art history books. There's one, it's like the early history of art that I find very interesting because there is an etching of the Canova statue that's atop that's the basis for the top of the Court Square fountain, and it's of Hebe, who was the original wine.
That's right. She served the
gods.
Yeah, she was the cupbearer to the gods.
So on top of the Court Square fountain, she's got a cup in one hand, or she's pouring, and but she's basically she has.
I have to pull that up.
Yeah, but you can look. I'll put it on the show notes. But it's the Canova, and so in that art book, which we know the Sayre family had, there are a variety of early sculptures, and they're far more, I would say, toward erotic, or they're a far more elegant version of a nude than any of the Decameron. Like the Decameron was kind of like it was cheap. Go ahead.
Oh, some of the other books that Zelda mentions, The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy. I didn't have a chance to look that up to tell you what the plot points were. The House of Pomegranates by Oscar Wilde, which are more of his fairy tales. And
they're adult fairy tales.
Oh, yeah.
And that's again, the average person is not going to be reading Wilde in 1900.
The Light That Failed by Rudyard Kipling, which I believe is about an artist who's going blind.
Yeah, he's a war veteran. His name is Dick. He's an artist. It's about unrequited love. And just reading the synopsis of it was similar enough that I wondered if there was any influence or nod in Tender as the Night. Because you have, there's also the question of, I think he's painting melancholia, and there's this question. I don't think they would have used the word mental health at that time.
Right.
But to me, it had kind of vague
overtones.
Or similarities to Tender as the Night.
And we do know that Fitzgerald was giving Sheila Graham, who was his girlfriend in the 30s up until he died, books by Kipling. Yeah. So it's I couldn't find, unfortunately, I did not find The Light That Failed on the list, but there were other Kipling novels. So obviously...
Well, in Save Me the Waltz, I'm just wondering, Zelda, there is a great rivalry, and it's the beginning and the end of the Fitzgerald's marriage that she writes Save Me the Waltz, because it's about their time really on the Riviera. I like it because the beginning, again, is semi-autobiographical in the Montgomery part. but that Scott was furious that Zelda had used their time on the Riviera. And then when you read them, I think it's good to read Save Me the Waltz and then Tender is the Night together, because you're getting they're both describing their lives, but you're getting the perspective. So in Tender is the Night, Dick Driver is a psychiatrist who has this wife and is an artist. Dick
Driver's occupation?
Yeah, because he's there's the artist part.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wonder if Zelda included the Kipling as a nod or a swipe to his use of
very interesting,
because we know, and it's probably, you can read excerpts from it in Milford, but the transcript of them arguing about, how he's used his material, or that their life is his material, and that she had used it in Save Me the Waltz.
And of course, Dick Driver is based on Gerald Murphy, their great friend, who was, in fact, an artist.
Yes, but it also, I think Tender is the Night is kind of both. Because he wrote it, 7 years. It kind of begins with the Murphys, but then as it goes on, it really becomes their story. It's like, I know that Dick Driver, he's a psychiatrist, and his wife is basically one of his patients, which you also think is interesting that it would have been okay for a doctor to marry one of their patients in the 30s.
Well, times changed.
Time changed, yeah.
I would believe what that theory.
I'm not a Scott Fitzgerald scholar, so I don't know if that's just a tentative. But that's something we'll try to.
I think it's always fun to see these connections.
Yeah, or to follow the thread and see if it. Also, I want to go back, because at the end of our last podcast, we brought up briefly the term Ishkabibble. And I don't know. You
have the history of Ishkabibble?
Yes, because there was an actor who would have been after this, whose stage name was Ishkabibble. Mm-hmm. And he did a lot of TV and movies. He performed with Kay Kaiser. But the term Ishkabibble, and there was actually a song, but it comes from the Yiddish expression Ishkabibble, but it means why should I worry? Mm-hmm. And it is the foundation for Alfred E. Newman of Mad Magazine.
I was just thinking that. What me worry?
So Ishkabibble first, and I think the way that Zelda was using it as a young child is, I'm just wondering, again, when we kind of go back to the honeybees, is that her mother's friends with a rabbi. Mm-hmm. It is
could be using this kind of slang.
Yeah, so it's a kind of Yiddish expression, which could be either Jewish or to a certain extent German too. Mm-hmm. But Ishkabibble, why worry? That it becomes the stage name of this early comic. I found. I'm trying to figure. You can look him up. And he also has the hair kind of like Moe in the Three Stooges.
Yeah.
So the next, his Ishkabibble becomes the basis for What Me Worry for
Alfred E. Newman. That's Mad Magazine.
So that's
I find that really fascinating.
So we go from Zelda saying Ishkabibble to her father to all the way to Alfred E. Newman.
That's great.
So I guess we'll wrap it up there. We hope everyone is well. In terms of the museum being open, again, through July, it will be kind of appointment. You can call ahead, or when you arrive, call, and then you come in. Things may change because we don't, like everyone else in the world, things are kind of up and down. Also, our Airbnbs are open. I know a lot of people traveling, like if they have a home and they're traveling to another home, the Airbnbs are a very good alternative to staying in hotels. We've had a number of people stay. They bring their own food. They cook. So it's a good and safe way if you have to travel. We've had people come and stay with us who are checking on parents or taking parents home. So I'd say come visit us, but you may want to wait. But if you have to travel and if you are traveling through here, our Airbnbs are actually a very good alternative. And when things do settle down, please come visit us.
Oh, please.
Yes, we and also if
we
you
miss you.
Yes. Also, if you have any questions as we move forward,
any answers.
Yes, or any answers. We're still sleuthing out Boodler's Bend. But our upcoming, we'll probably talk about Zelda's schools and begin her high school years in anticipation of eventually meeting Scott Fitzgerald in 1918.
Sounds good.
So we hope you're all well, and we will return next week. Bye.